Chapter 16 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. A Sound in the Sky. Goodbye, Tom. So long, Jack. Keep watch for our signal. We'll call you.
I will that. And if it's in trouble you are, Dave and me'll be riding just as fast as we can to help you. I wish you'd let me go along. I'm half minded to follow you.
No. We'll stand our best chance alone. They won't suspect we're other than a bunch of wild young fellows out for adventure. Tom grumbled, but the force of the reasoning was apparent to him. They leaned from their horses for a last firm hand clasp. Then Jack rode on to join Bob and Frank, who sat on their horses some distance ahead.
"You're the boy to give it to him, Jack," called the big ex-cowboy in a last farewell. "Give him thunder."
Jack waved a parting salute as he joined his comrades. Frank and Bob did likewise. Then, with night settling down over the vast desert waste, they rode on into Old Mexico. Beside the white stone marking the international boundary, Tom Bodine sat his horse like a statue. Moodily he watched until they were out of sight. It was a hard life Tom had led in his day, and when he took the job at the radio plant, it was with a sigh of relief at the ease ahead of him. But now, despite his 50 years, the last 30 of which had been filled with hard knocks, he felt the old call to adventure urging him on. With a drooping head, he turned his horse toward home. But hardly had the animal started forward than he dragged it about again.
"Let's go,"
he shouted to the empty silence, and whirling his sombrero aloft, brought it down on his horse's flank. Then he rode on after the three figures that had been swallowed up in the darkness. Far ahead of him, for Tom had taken considerable time to reach his decision, rode the three companions. The young moon shed only a wan and wraith-like radiance over the plain. They were alone, and the parting with their last friend, combined with the solitude of the open spaces, had its effect upon them. They rode a while in subdued silence, but not for long. Frank's lively spirits were the first to rebound. "Race you to that rock," he cried, pointing to a solitary outcropping of rock about twice a man's height, about a quarter of a mile ahead. "You're on," cried Jack, spurring his horse.
"Atta boy," yelled Bob, doing likewise.
With a shout that shattered the silence as if a band of wild Indians were hitting the trail, the three boys dashed away. Presently they pulled up by the rock, practically neck and neck. Their eyes were alight now with the zest of adventure. "Gee, it's great to be alive," cried Frank.
"You said it," declared Bob.
Jack nodded laughingly, but the next moment his face became grave. "Just the same," he said, "we mustn't do that again."
"Why not?" demanded Bob.
"Well, for one thing, we must save our horses as much as possible. We already have come 20 miles, and we have 30 miles more to go before reaching Tom's cave."
"For one thing?" questioned Bob. "What's your other reason?"
"Just that we don't want to draw attention to ourselves." "You're right, Jack," said Frank. "I'll not start anything again." They jogged on. A martial trio they made. Jack was clothed in the khaki shirt, riding breeches, high-laced leather boots, and sombrero in which he had met the boys on their arrival at Ransom. Bob and Frank were similarly outfitted. Tom Bodine was about of Bob's proportions, and his partner, Dave Morningstar, had the build of a slighter Frank. These two old cow-punchers had given the boys the run of their wardrobes. Each lad carried an automatic at his hip, swinging from the well-fitted cartridge belt. In addition, Jack bore his repeating rifle in a leather scabbard on his saddle. Frank cast an appraising eye over himself and his comrades, and grinned with approval. Despite Jack's rebuke, he could not long keep silence. "Well, here we go, fellows," he said cheerfully. "Just like the Three Musketeers. Jack, with your air of melancholy, you can be Athos. Bob is big enough to be Porthos, although I have got his appetite. I am Aramis."
"Aramis was always dreaming about the ladies," said Bob slyly. "Heard from Della lately?"
Frank was silent a moment under the sly dig, his thoughts flying back to the faraway Long Island home. But his irrepressible spirits would not permit him to remain silent for long, and soon he burst forth again. "All we need to make it complete," he said, "is D'Artagnan. I wonder if we'll find him." Jack made no answer. His thoughts were busy turning over plans for the rescue of his father. Bob, too, was unusually silent, thinking of the parting from his own father and the latter's anxiety which had almost prevented his making this venture. Frank pursed his lips to whistle, thought better of it, and jogged along as silent as his companions. So they rode hour after hour, only the creak of leather, the occasional stumble of a horse, or the distant call of a coyote breaking the stillness. At length a low range of foothills, upflung before them, began to take shape out of the darkness with their near approach. Presently Jack called a halt. "Somewhere in there," said he, "lies Tom's cave." It was in the early hours before dawn, when the darkness, if anything, becomes more intense. A chill nipping wind long since had caused the boys to unroll the rubber ponchos strapped to the back of their saddles, and drape them over their shoulders. As they stood now in the eerie darkness, striving vainly to locate the landmarks of tree and rock which Tom had given them, the howl of a hunting coyote floated down the wind. The sensitive Frank shivered. "That sends goose flesh up my spine," he said. "Are you scared?" asked Bob. "I'm scared stiff," averred Frank. "My hair is standing up so straight, I wonder how my sombrero stays on." "Me too," said Bob. "Liar," said Frank. "You're another," said Bob. "You're not scared. I know you too well." They grinned affectionately at each other. Jack, who meantime had been investigating, turned with a worried expression. "I've followed Tom's directions faithfully," he said. "He said to lay our course south by southwest, and showed me what he meant on my compass. I haven't deviated a hair's breadth. Somewhere about here should be the first landmark. 3 rocks shaped like a camel lying down. But I can't see them." "Nothing to worry about in that," said Frank. "Probably we haven't gone far enough. Let's push on." "That must be it," said Jack with relief. "Well, come on." Before they could get into motion, however, Bob uttered a warning whisper. "Listen," he said. "I heard a horse stumble behind us on the trail." They listened breathlessly a moment, but no further sound was heard. "Keep your guns handy," whispered Jack. Whenever the 3 were together, he took command. "Don't fire without cause. However," he whispered, "if there is someone behind us, it may be another traveler." Again came the sound of a horse stumbling. All heard it distinctly. Jack peered into the darkness and called firmly, "Who are you?" "Challenge him in Spanish, why don't you?" muttered Frank. Before Jack could repeat his challenge, however, a familiar voice replied. "That you, Jack? This is Tom." "Tom? Tom Bodine?" "The same," replied the ex-cowboy, materializing out of the darkness and approaching. "And glad I am," he added, "to find you." "But good gracious, Tom, is anything the matter? Why are you here? I thought we left you heading back for home 5 hours ago." "No, you just left me," said Tom. "That's all. I didn't head home, 'cause I wanted to come along. Been trailing you all the way, and here I am." Jack was surprised indeed. But now that Tom was with them, he experienced a sense of relief. To venture into a strange land without a guide, and in pitch darkness besides, was a pretty stiff undertaking. The responsibility of looking after his friends was no light one. "To tell the truth, Tom," Jack said, "I'm glad you came." Bob and Frank echoed his words heartily. "I had just about decided when you came up," Jack added, "that I had lost my way. Frank thought, however, we merely hadn't gone far enough to find your landmarks." "He was right," said Tom. "You came straight as a die. All we got to do is ride on a piece, and then we'll be in the snuggest cave you ever saw." Riding 2 abreast, Tom and Jack in the lead and Frank and Bob close behind, they pressed on another 20 minutes, when Tom called a halt to indicate a clump of rocks close at hand which suggested in their outline a crouching camel. Then he led the way toward the left. "Wait, wait," called Bob in a tense voice that reached the ears of all and caused them to halt. "Keep your horses quiet and listen. There, I was right." All sat silent. Distinctly there came to their ears the hum of an approaching airplane. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. Inside the Cave. "What is it?" whispered Tom Bodine, to whom the sound was unfamiliar. "Sounds like machinery of some kind." "It's an airplane," Jack answered. "Airplane? An airplane?" said Bob, low-voiced. "It's better than that. It's our airplane, if I know anything." "Right-o, Bob," agreed Frank. "I know that old baby's voice a mile off." "They've shut off the motor," said Jack. "They must be going to land. But where in the world could they land in these hills and in this darkness, too?" Tom Bodine slapped his knee. "That's it," he said emphatically. "That must be it." "What?" asked Jack.
Why, there's a big level place just below the cave I was telling you about. A plateau, smooth as the floor." The hum of the airplane had died away. The boys and their guide never caught sight of the machine in the darkness. Suddenly Frank pointed in the direction whence the sound of the airplane had come, ahead and slightly to the left.
"I thought I saw a light there," he whispered. "It was just a faint streak of orange, and now it's gone."
"Look here," said Bob to Tom Bodine. "Does that cave face this way, or is it on the other side of the hill?" "It's on t'other side," answered Tom, "and near the top." "Well, I bet you there's somebody in that cave, and the light that Frank saw was some kind of a signal to the airplane."
The big ex-cowboy scratched his head.
"Maybe you're right," he said doubtfully. "I don't know about such things, but who'd have thought the cave would be discovered? Why, I just came on it accidental like onct when I was wandering round these hills."
"Boys, there's only one thing to do," said Jack in a determined voice, "and that's to investigate." "Right-o, Jack," said Frank eagerly. "Here's our chance to get back our airplane."
"You said it," declared Bob. "Let's go."
"Not so fast," said Jack. "First we must have a plan of campaign. Tom, what's the lay of the land? How far away is the cave? Would it be better to leave our horses here or approach on foot?"
"Cave's not more than half a mile from here," answered Tom. "It's just round the shoulder of this hill they're on right now near the top. I told you about that big rock in front of the entrance, and them 3 lonesome trees and the foot that gave you the bee line to the rock. Well, we can get up to them trees without being noticed and tie our horses there and sneak up by foot."
"Is there only one entrance to the cave?"
"Only one," answered Tom. "There's a kind of chimney up through the rock at the top of the hill, but nobody could get out there in much of a hurry. We won't have to worry about that."
Frank had an idea. "How far would those fellows in the airplane have to go to reach the cave after landing?"
"Oh, let's see. About as fur as us as I can reckon."
"Maybe we can cut them off before they enter the cave," said Frank. "They'll be busy about the airplane for several minutes before they start to make their way to the cave. How would they have to approach the cave?"
"Same way as us from the trees on," said Tom.
"Well, if we hurry," Frank declared excitedly, "maybe we can capture them before they reach the cave."
"Right you are, young feller," approved Tom. "But we'll have to leave our horses behind or they might give us away. Can't tie 'em to those trees like we planned."
"We can't hobble them," said Jack, thinking quickly, "because they would wander aside a little distance anyway. And we may want them again in a hurry."
"Tell you what," said Tom. "Seems like I remember a clump of trees just this side of them 3 I spoke about. We can tie 'em there. And them fellers in the machine won't have no horses, so ours ain't likely to nicker."
"Good," said Jack. "You lead the way and we'll follow." Presently, at a low-spoken word from the guide, the boys dismounted and tied up their horses. Then Jack, carrying his rifle, and the others following close at his heels, revolvers in hand, they pressed on toward the 3 trees forming Tom Bodine's landmark. As they reached the trees, low exclamations burst from the boys. Hitherto they had been cut off from the plateau by the shoulder of the hill. Now it lay below and before them. This of itself would not have permitted them to see, as the darkness was intense, but now the scene was illuminated by a number of oil flares struck upright in the ground in a rude circle. And right in the middle of the circle was the airplane stolen from Bob and Frank. There could be no mistaking the all-metal body, nor the peculiar wing spread, even at that distance of close to half a mile. Several figures were moving about. As the boys looked on, these seized oil flares and started moving toward them. "Here's where our turn comes at last," said Frank. Jack laid a hand on his arm. "Better than that, Frank," he said. "How many do you make out?" "3 is my guess." "The 2 men in the airplane and the man in charge of the cave," said Jack. "Dollars to doughnuts, the cave is undefended right this minute. What do you say to capturing it and laying for them there?" All 4 were grouped together, and consequently all heard Jack's proposal. Bob and Tom Bodine agreed eagerly. "Lead the way then, Tom," said Jack, "because you know the route. And be quick." Swiftly, yet withal cautiously, because the cave might be defended, they approached the big rock. As they sidled around it, a gleam of light from the mouth of the cave at the rear of the rock fell athwart their path. Involuntarily, they drew back. Then Jack brushed Tom Bodine aside and took the lead, his repeater thrust before him. Crouching, he entered the mouth of the cave. A moment later, his whisper came back. "The coast is clear." But the others already were at his heels. A hasty glance around revealed the first of the 2 chambers, which Tom had said the cave possessed, was luxuriously finished and lighted by a powerful electric bulb enclosed in a huge frosted globe suspended from the middle of the roof. There was no time for further investigation because Jack already was pushing on toward the heavy hangings at the rear covering the mouth of the second chamber, and the others clung to his heels. Parting the hangings quickly, Jack threw his rifle to his shoulder. Then he and his companions received their second big surprise. The room was empty of human occupants, but it too was brilliantly lighted. And it was a radio broadcasting station. To the trained eyes of the boys, that much was apparent at first glance. In one corner of the tremendous cave hummed the dynamo. From it, of course, came also the electricity for the lights. Before they could pursue their investigations, however, Tom Bodine, who had dropped back to the outer entrance, issued a warning hiss. Then he darted across the outer room and joined them. 3 of them, he whispered. They'll be here in a minute. Good, said Jack, taking command. We'll give them a surprise. These hangings are fastened to rings on a big pole up above us there, and they'll slide easily. Tom, you and Bob grab the hangings in the middle and be ready to pull them aside when I say the word. Frank, you and I will stand here in the middle and keep them covered. All took their assigned positions as the sound of voices was heard at the outer entrance. Jack peered between the 2 folds of the hangings and smiled with satisfaction. Let's go, he said. The hangings flew aside. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. The Fight in the Cave. Hands up, gentlemen, ordered Jack, rifle to shoulder. And be quick about it, added Frank, revolver extended. Tom and Bob, the hangings disposed of, ranged themselves on either side of the pair. 4 weapons covered the group in the outer room. The 3 men, who had advanced well to the center of the room, stared dumbfounded at these apparitions. Then amazement gave place to anger, and one of the trio made a move as if to draw his revolver. None of that, commanded Jack sternly. Up with them quick, or I'll shoot. 3 pairs of hands were unwillingly elevated. 2 of the men wore sheepskin jackets and leather helmets, and the boys surmised correctly that they had been up in the airplane. Bob felt certain that they were Morales and von Arnheim, the 2 who had made the trip to the east to steal Mr. Hampton's papers and whom he had foiled in that purpose, but who had succeeded in stealing the airplane and making their way to Mexico in it. The other was a rangy man of about 26, keen and shrewd-looking, and had the appearance of an American. Evidently he was the guardian of the cave, and it was he who had moved to draw his weapon when surprised. A tough customer, and one to be watched, thought the boys. Face about, ordered Jack. They obeyed. Keep them covered, Tom, Jack commanded. We'll search them. With weapons held ready, the 3 boys advanced. At that moment, the caretaker of the cave took 1 step forward, and instantly the lights in both rooms faded out and the cave was in inky darkness. He had pressed a button in the floor, switching off the lights. The boys were so taken by surprise that for a moment they did not fire. Neither did Tom, for fear of hitting them as they were in front of him. This gave their 3 enemies an opportunity to shift position and fling themselves prone. When, after their surprise, the boys did fire, their bullets merely pinged against the distant wall and did no damage. But the flash of their weapons betrayed their positions, and answering bullets came uncomfortably close. One swept Jack's hat from his head. From behind them, Tom Bodine's revolver spoke, as the enemy thus betrayed themselves. The soft thud of a bullet striking flesh, a groan, choked off in the middle, a hasty scrambling to get away from the danger point on the part of the man struck, then silence. This silence was so profound the boys seemed to hear the beating of their own hearts, and tried to hold their breath for fear of betrayal. They had thrown themselves prone after the first volley, and lay so close they were touching, Jack in the middle. Each side was fearful now of firing at each other, lest the flashes give their position, and answering bullets find its mark. Jack thought quickly. Putting his lips to the ear of each of his companions in turn, he whispered, "Wait till I get Tom and come back. Then we'll make our way to the entrance." Each signified by the pressure of a hand that he understood. Certainly it would not do to have the enemy escape and thus cut them off in the cave. Slowly, carefully, noiselessly, Jack wormed his way to the rear, and when he considered he must be in Tom Bodine's neighborhood, he began whispering in a tone that could not be heard more than 3 feet away. "Tom, Tom, Tom." A hand gripped his leg.
A voice whispered so low it was barely audible to him.
"That you, Jack?"
"Yes. Listen." Running a hand over Tom Bodine's body, Jack found his ear, and, as he had done with Bob and Frank, set his lips to it. He explained his purpose to gain the entrance of the cave and prevent being bottled up. Tom nodded approval, and Jack was about to return to his companions when he suddenly thought of the radio room behind and its possibilities. It would never do to leave that unguarded. Their enemies could telephone the Calomares ranch. Then, even if the boys escaped, their identities would have become known at rebel headquarters. Their chances of rescuing Mr. Hampton would go glimmering. Once more Jack set his lips to Tom's ears and explained the situation.
"That's right," whispered Tom in return. "Tell you what, I'll guard this here inner room from behind the rocks in this doorway. You three stop up the outer entrance, and we'll have 'em bottled."
Jack made his way back to his comrades, and the three started crawling. They moved inch by inch so as to avoid bumping into furniture. A number of heavy chairs had been seen standing about the great room. Jack was in the lead, Frank at his heels, Bob bringing up the rear. Cautiously, tortuously, they made their way ahead for what seemed like ages, pausing frequently to listen. After one such pause, as he again started to follow Frank, Bob felt a form brush against him from the side. Then an arm shot out and encircled his neck. Bob wriggled about to face his opponent and threw both arms about him in a mighty clasp. As they fell to the floor, Bob heard a strangled cry from Frank and a grunt from Jack. They, too, had come to grips with the enemy. Their three opponents had started for the door with the same purpose held by the boys, that of bottling up the other side. The two crawling trios had brushed against each other in the middle of the floor. Now 3 individual fights raged furiously on the floor of the cave in Stygian darkness. Every man fought for his life. The sob of labored breathing was the only sound. That and the threshing about of bodies. Tom Bodine was sick with rage at his helplessness, for he dared not shoot lest he hit one of the boys, and he could not see to take a hand. He decided to try and find that button in the middle of the floor of the outer cave which the enemy had used to throw off the lights. If not that, perhaps there was a wall switch somewhere. In his pocket was a box of safety matches. With these in his hands, he started for what he thought was the middle of the room. Recklessly, Tom struck and lighted matches, searching the floor for that button, stopping after each match burned down to his fingers to listen to the panting, heaving struggle going on about him. At last he found the button and pressed it. Light once more flooded both caves, dazzling to the eye after the pitch darkness of the moment before. Jack and Frank were still tightly locked with their respective foemen. But at the very moment the lights were switched on, Bob got the upper hand of his man with a famous hold he had used to his advantage in winning his wrestling fame at school. There was a heave, and then Bob straightened up and the other went hurtling through the air. He was the American of the enemy trio. The man fell on his left side, a yard or more away, by a quick twist avoiding the descent on his head, which is the usual result of such a wrestling toss. His right arm was outflung, and as he skidded along the floor, the fingers of his right hand came in contact with a revolver dropped by one of the wrestlers. Twisting about like a cat with a convulsive movement, the man came to his knees and fired. There was a warning shout to Bob from Tom Bodine, but the man's aim was far from steady, and the shot went wide. Bob leaped forward as if shot from a catapult, letting out a wild yell as he did so. It was a tremendous leap from a standing position, and he descended feet first on the other before he could discharge the revolver again. Beneath the impact of Bob's weight, the man went down like a shot rabbit and lay still. Bob disarmed him, turned him on his face, pulled his arms behind him, and began tying them with his belt. Meantime, Jack was getting the better of his man, the Mexican. But Frank, slightest of the 3 boys, was putting up a losing fight against the German. The latter had him down and was kneeling on his chest with his hands throttling the boy. Frank's face was purple and the breath was whistling in his throat, while his efforts to throw the other off were becoming more and more feeble. Tom Bodine took in the situation and sprang forward, clubbing his revolver. He brought it down on the German's head. There was a sickening thud. One blow was enough. The German's hands relaxed their grip on Frank's throat, and he rolled over unconscious. At the same moment, Jack pinioned the arms of the Mexican, and the latter lay helpless. The fight was over. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. Resting Up. Swiftly, Tom Bodine trussed up the unconscious German with the man's own belt, while Jack similarly treated the thoroughly cowed Mexican Morales. Meanwhile, Bob went to Frank's aid, assisting him to a chair, bringing him water from a spring in a corner of the inner cave, and fanning him with his sombrero. None of the three boys had suffered more serious injuries than bruises, but Frank had been badly battered in the encounter with his heavier opponent, and the muscles on his left shoulder had been severely strained. Despite the mauling he had received, Frank wanted to go and inspect his beloved airplane at once, and Bob, the co-owner with him, was equally eager. Jack, however, protested. "No, sir," said he firmly. "You are in no condition to go chasing off down this rocky slope. The airplane isn't going to fly away. It's in a pocket in the hills that nobody's going to discover. And anyhow, there's nobody around in this desert place to do any discovering. Moreover," he continued, "it is almost morning now. We've all been riding all night, and with this fight coming on top of everything else, we're thoroughly tired out. So instead of any more conversation tonight, I propose that we turn in and go to sleep, leaving one man on guard. At the end of 2 hours, he can call another fellow, and in that way we can all get 4 or 5 hours of sleep. I'll take the first watch," and at that moment a groan from one of the prisoners on the other side of the room interrupted, and with an exclamation Bob started forward. "Good gracious," he said. "I'd forgotten all about that chap. His arm felt wet and sticky when we were wrestling, and I believe he's the man Tom wounded with that first shot in the darkness." Bending over his late opponent, Bob noted a dark brown stain on the left shoulder of his coat.
"Only a flesh wound, I reckon," said the other. "But it sure hurts. Are you going to leave me like this?" Bob flushed.
"Of course not," he said. "What do you think I am? Here, let me help you up and we'll have a look at it."
Bob assisted the other to a chair. His hands were then untied, the coat sleeve cut away, and examination made of his injury. It proved not serious. The man told Bob where to find a bottle of iodine. He winced under the sting of its application, but made no outcry. Then a rough bandage was made of clean handkerchiefs, and the boys stood back to examine their handiwork, for all had taken part in the operation.
"You're some fighter, kid," the other said approvingly to Bob. "But I reckon I'd have got you at that if it hadn't been for that arm."
"Maybe so," Bob modestly agreed. "You put up a stiff fight."
"You're an American, aren't you?" asked Frank. "What's your name? And how do you happen to be with these fellows?"
"Why not?" said the other, answering the last question first. "I'm a Rolling Stone and joined up with this outfit because it looked like something doing, and that's what I want. As for my name, it's Roy Stone, and you guessed right, I am American, born and raised in Worcester, out in Ohio." He paused and looked curiously from one to the other of the boys. Tom Bodine was examining the other two prisoners for possible injuries needing attention. Stone nodded toward him. "I can place a fellow like that all right," he said. "Know this kind down here on the border. But who are you? You're only kids. What's your game? Are you with Obregon?"
"No, indeed," said Bob.
Turning to Jack, he whispered,
"Is it safe to tell him who we are? He's an American, and somehow I have an idea he might help us."
"Well, it won't hurt, I guess," said Jack doubtfully. "He might escape and betray us to rebel headquarters, but I suspect we can guard against that. Besides, he's bound to find out our identities because those other two chaps will recognize you."
"Hardly in this rig," said Bob, referring to his clothing. "We talked all that over, you remember."
"That's right. I had forgotten." Bob and Jack had drawn aside during the whispered colloquy. Now Bob turned back to his prisoner.
"Look here," he said. "We'll have a little talk later. Right now we all need a good sleep."
Without more ado, Bob and Frank tied Stone's hands and led him to his bed behind a curtain in one corner of the outer room. They considered that inasmuch as he was wounded, he was entitled to the bed. The German had recovered consciousness from the blow on the head dealt him by Tom, and the latter already had ranged him and the Mexican along the wall where the sentinel could keep an eye on them. For themselves, the boys pulled a heavy rug to another portion of the wall, spread the heavy hangings formerly covering the door to the inner cave on top, and here Bob and Frank lay down with their ponchos over them. Presently they were joined by Jack, who had planned to mount guard the first 2 hours, but who had been overruled by Tom Bodine.
"No, you don't," said the latter. "I'm a tougher bird than you, and I take this job myself, and that goes."
Too tired to protest very vehemently, Jack turned in after exacting a promise that Tom would call him at the end of 2 hours. The old cowman, however, had no such intention. It was not until 8 hours later that he summoned Jack. The lights in the cave still burned brightly, for Tom had refrained from switching them off for the obvious reason that they made it easy to keep an eye on the prisoners. Daylight, however, showed at the mouth of the cave. When Jack noted the time, he began to scold.
"Forget it," said Tom Bodine gruffly. "You boys needed a good sleep while I'm an old hand at riding night herd. Didn't bother me none to stay up."
Without further words, he turned in and was asleep almost on the instant. Jack roused Bob and Frank, and while Bob mounted guard at the mouth of the cave, where he could keep watch both on their prisoners and on the approach from below, the two others explored a rude pantry behind a curtain. They found a plentiful stock of provisions, which made it unnecessary for them to draw upon their own limited food supplies for breakfast. When they themselves had eaten, they released the captives one at a time and fed them, afterwards replacing their bonds. The Mexican and the German were surly and uncommunicative. The latter tried to ply them with questions, but when they refused to answer, he adopted a bullying tone and threatened them with all sorts of dire punishment. His threats, however, were no more effective at breaking down their silence than were his questions. Bob remained at the doorway to avoid the risk of recognition by Morales and von Arnheim as the youth who had foiled their attempt to steal Mr. Hampton's papers from his Long Island home. Jack, who had no means of knowing how much the traitor Rollins might have told von Arnheim in the past about Mr. Hampton's personal affairs, watched keenly for some indication on the German's part that he had formed an idea as to their identity, but none was forthcoming. Jack was correspondingly elated. "I suppose," he said to Frank, after Morales and von Arnheim had been fed and returned to the other side of the cave, "that Rollins never bothered to speak about us because we were just boys. Then, too, you fellows arrived only the very day that we discovered Rollins' treachery and put a stop to his communications with these people." "That may all be true," said Frank. "Probably it is. Just the same, von Arnheim and Morales are bound to put two and two together and make a shrewd guess as to our identities, even if they say nothing to us about the matter. But," he added confidently, "what if they do? We have them prisoners now, and if we keep them well guarded until we have rescued your father, what does it matter how much they know?" Jack nodded in agreement. "We'll have to keep mighty strict watch, though," he said. "Well, now let's feed this American Stone. I'll draw straws with you to see who keeps guard while Bob comes to get his breakfast at the same time. He wants to talk to Stone," he said. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. Conferring by Radio. Bob, however, told his companions he had decided not to interview Stone for the time being, and explained his reason, as well as what he hoped to gain from conversation with the prisoner. "I believe," he declared, "that Stone is a warm-hearted, adventurous young fellow with no particular love for the Mexican rebels, but merely serving under their banner for the excitement. And I believe if we approach him right, we can win his help in rescuing Mr. Hampton. He must know a good deal about this Calomares ranch, and if we can get him to give us some pointers, it will be worthwhile. That was what I had in mind last night. But mounting guard here this morning, I had time to think it over, and I decided we had better go slow, and, if possible, get advice of my father on the matter." "But how could you do that?" asked Frank. "Go back to Hampton Ranch again?" Jack interrupted excitedly. "No, Frank, don't you see?" he said. "Bob is thinking of the radio here in the cave. Aren't you, Bob? I'm a simpleton not to have thought of it before." "Well," said Bob, "we've all been so excited, that's not to be wondered at. But while I mounted guard here during your breakfast, I had a chance to calm down and do some thinking." Bob was eager to use the radio telephone at once, but Jack persuaded him to eat breakfast first. The big fellow literally bolted his bacon, bread, and coffee, and then, accompanied by Jack, while Frank mounted guard, he retired to the inner room where the radio outfit was located. "Let's have a look around here before we try to telephone," said Jack. "It will take us only a few minutes, and we ought to know what we have captured. What say?" "Fair enough," agreed Bob. A cursory inspection quickly convinced Jack that the station was not of recent installation, but had been put in about the year 1918. Much of the equipment, while of the best at the time it was put in, had been antiquated since by improved parts. It was a complete two-way installation, however, comprising a generator of practically sustained waves, a good control system to modulate the output, and a ground system for radiating a portion of the modulated energy, as well as a receiver and a good amplifier. "Here's the chimney in the rock about which Tom spoke," Jack pointed out. "They have hooked it up through this. And the antenna, I suppose, is on top of the rock above us." This arc," he continued, advancing to the coils, "looks pretty strong and seems to have a rather elaborate water cooling system. I think it is of foreign design, probably German. The Germans were early in the field with radio telephony development, you know." "All right," said Bob, who was beginning to grow impatient. "I'll take your word for it. But what I want to know is, can we telephone my father at your ranch?" "Say, Bob, I'm sorry," Jack said quickly. "You know how crazy Dad and I are over this radio telephone. But of course you're anxious to get to your father. Come on, let's try. I'll throw on the generator." Suiting actions to words, Jack shortly had the generator at work, while Bob began calling through the air for his father. "Be careful to use our code," Jack warned him. "You know Rollins said these fellows had a powerful radio station at the Calomares ranch, and if they were to pick up your call and listen in, there'd be trouble." "Right," said Bob. "But if Dave answers the signal, I'll have to ask for father because Dave doesn't understand the code." It was Dave Morningstar who answered. The other ex-cowboy employed as mechanic and guard at Mr. Hampton's radio plant in New Mexico. And when he had tuned to the proper pitch to hear distinctly, and Bob's voice greeted him, he was so surprised he stuttered and was incapable for a moment of coherent speech. Then he began to pour a flood of questions at Bob, wanting to know where he was, how he happened to be able to radio, what had happened to the boys, why Tom Bodine, his partner, had failed to return, and so on. But Bob cut him short. "Stop it, Dave," he said. "We may be overheard. Call father to the telephone so I can speak in code, and then I'll explain." Fortunately, although it was past noon, Mr. Temple was at hand. So anxious was he about the boys that he had been unable to sleep during the night. All morning, despite the belief that it was folly to expect to hear from the lads so early, he had stayed at the radio plant. Now, when he heard his son's voice, there was heartfelt thanksgiving in his reply.
"Is it really you, Bob?" he asked, speaking in code. "I must have been insane to let you three lads go off on such a foolish venture. I have been tortured with anxiety every minute since you left. Tell me, where are you and what has happened? And how in the world is it possible for you to radio? Are you all right?"
"Yeah, we're all right, Dad," answered Bob, and there was a good deal of emotion in his voice, too. The big fellow and his father were real pals. "Don't you worry, Dad," he added. "We're doing well. Thank you." Then he retailed their adventures from the time of crossing the border into Old Mexico and leaving Tom Bodine at the boundary. There were many interruptions from his father.
"Thank heaven," said the latter, when learning that Tom Bodine had followed the boys and joined them. "He's a trustworthy chap, and to know that he's with you makes me breathe more easily."
When he came to relate the fight in the cave, Bob diplomatically made little of it. He felt there was nothing to be gained by unnecessarily harrowing the feelings of his father. The latter's anxiety, however, was great, and he pumped rapid questions at his son, which Bob could not avoid answering. The result was that Mr. Temple gained a fairly accurate idea of the peril in which the boys had been involved. "But, Dad," Bob interrupted his parents' horrified exclamations, "it's all over now. None of us is injured, and we've got back our plane."
"I know, Bob, I know," answered the older man. "But you can't understand a father's feelings. And it isn't all over yet by any means, for you haven't rescued Mr. Hampton, and you don't know what difficulties you will encounter in doing so, and what dangers you will run."
"Oh, I believe the worst is over, Dad," answered Bob. "We have captured Morales and Von Arnheim, and they were our two worst dangers. If we had encountered them at the rebel headquarters and they recognized me, our goose would have been cooked. We would have been taken prisoners, too. But now there will be nobody to recognize us. The rebels will take us for what we pretend to be, young Americans seeking adventure and riding in to enlist."
"Perhaps, Bob," said his father, only half convinced. "But let me think this over. There ought to be some other way to rescue Mr. Hampton now that you have the airplane again. Also, you have these prisoners. It may be that you can gain some valuable information from them. Have you questioned them yet?"
"That's just what I was coming to, Dad," said Bob. Thereupon he proceeded to tell his father of Roy Stone, the young American in charge of the radio plant in the cave, whom they had made prisoner. A lengthy conversation ensued. Mr. Temple was reluctant at first to have the boys reveal their identities, inasmuch as so far they had escaped detection. But he saw that if an ally could be made of Stone, it would be of the highest importance to the boys. He finally authorized Bob to promise Stone a suitable reward if he thought that would appeal to him. Then, enjoining Bob to take no further steps without first consulting him by radio, Mr. Temple concluded the conversation. To Jack and Frank, speaking in low tones at the entrance to the cave where Frank kept guard, Bob explained the gist of his conversation with his father. Tom Bodine still slumbered heavily. Stone lay napping in his bed. Morales and Von Arnheim sat with drooping heads in the heavy chairs where, while Bob telephoned, Jack had thought it best to bind them. "Well, let's talk with Stone and see what he has to say," Jack said. "Frank and I have been talking the situation over too, and we've got all sorts of ideas. For one thing, we thought there was a chance the rebels could be persuaded to exchange father for Von Arnheim and Morales. Stone might know how important those two worthies are considered by the rebels." "Can't I listen in on this confab?" Frank asked plaintively. "Or must I continue to mount guard here? Besides, I want to go down and look at our airplane and pat it, even if I can't get in and fly. I can see it from here, and it looks tempting." "You'll have to wait a while to do that, I expect," said Jack with a smile. "We must decide what to do next before we spend any time playing." At that moment, Tom Bodine yawned prodigiously and sat up in his makeshift couch. "At least I can have a voice in the conference," said Frank. "If Tom's awake, he can mount guard." "All right, fine," said Jack. "We'll leave him out here with Morales and Von Arnheim as soon as he has something to eat. Then the three of us can take Stone into the other room and have a talk with him." So it was arranged. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of the Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. Gaining an Ally. Before mounting guard, however, Tom thought of their horses, a detail which the boys had forgotten in the quick march of events. He and Bob descended the slope, brought the animals into the valley where there was grass along the bed of a little stream trickling from a spring, and a few trees that provided shade. The horses were hobbled to prevent wandering too far, and then left to do as they pleased. They pleased, every one, to lie down at once and roll. Upon their return to the cave, after Bob first had inspected the airplane and found it in tip-top condition and stocked with gas and oil, Tom mounted guard while the boys carried out their intention of taking Stone into the inner room for a conference. Stone made matters easy for all concerned by speaking first, as soon as they were all out of earshot of Morales and Von Arnheim, and telling the boys that he had guessed their identities.
"Of course, I don't know your names," he said, "but I reckon one of you is the son of that American big bug old Calomares is holding prisoner up at his ranch, and the rest of you are his pals."
Bob's face fell. He had believed their identities were unsuspected. If this man could draw so clever a deduction, then their two other prisoners could do likewise. Moreover, if they carried out their original plan and went to rebel headquarters to enlist, would they not there too be suspected?
"Do the others guess who we are?" he asked.
"Don't know," said Stone. "I haven't been given much chance to talk to him, have I? But the German is smart, and he may suspect. But," and with this statement, he set at rest a part of Bob's fears, "my bed is pretty close to this room, and I have pretty good ears. I overheard some things that Morales and Von Arnheim couldn't hear, especially when you used the radio to call your father. Anyhow, I thought it was your father. Mostly you spoke in code, but I heard you call him Dad a couple of times."
The three chums looked at each other, nonplussed. Stone laughed.
"Until I made out who you were," he said. "I thought you were some wild-eyed kids looking for adventure and coming to the right place to find it. But once I got a suspicion, it was easy to figure out the rest. You see, I knew about your owning the airplane that Von Arnheim stole, and about your radio stations. When you started the generator, that showed me you knew something about radio. And that was another clue. So I just put two and two together. Anyhow, it finally came to me who you were. Am I right?"
"Yes," said Jack, taking the initiative as Stone concluded. "You are correct. It is my father who is held prisoner by the Mexicans, and these are my chums." Jack regarded the others searchingly. "We're in trouble," he said simply, "and we need help that you could give us. How closely are you tied up with the rebels? You're an American, and we are Americans. Does that mean anything to you?"
"Yeah, kid, it does," said Stone.
Despite the fact that he was only 7 or 8 years older than the three chums, he had led a roving life that had given him a world of experience and an older viewpoint, and he persisted in regarding them as youngsters.
"I'm strong for the good old USA," he continued. "But don't get me wrong. These are fine people down here, and don't you believe they ain't. Their standards aren't American standards either, in manners or politics. But just the same, they're good folks, and don't you let anyone tell you different. I wouldn't turn against them for anything. So although your fathers have lots of money," here he looked fixedly at Bob, who felt uncomfortable remembering his father's authorization to offer Stone money to help them, "well, don't offer me any, that's all.
Bob was silent, but Jack again stepped into the breach. "Good for you," he said warmly. "I'm glad to hear you talk that way, but," and here Jack paused impressively, "suppose imprisonment of my father threatened the peace and prosperity of the good old USA, as you call it. What then?" Stone looked troubled.
"See here," he said. "What are you driving at?"
"Shall we tell him what Mr. Temple says is behind all of this?" Jack asked his companions. Bob and Frank nodded agreement. "Well," began Jack, "it's this way." Thereupon he proceeded to relate Mr. Temple's theory that the attacks on the independent oil operators, the capturing of Mr. Hampton, and the attempt engineered by Rollins and Remedios to capture himself were all part of a plan to embroil the United States government with President Obregon as the responsible head of the country whence the outrages originated. "And Mr. Temple says," concluded Jack, "that if the two countries did come to war, it would hurt us very much with all of Latin America."
"Sure would," agreed Stone thoughtfully. "I've knocked about among these Spanish-American republics for years, and they all look on little old USA as a dollar chaser and a bully."
He was silent for a moment, and when he resumed, he said,
"Look here. What you've just told me makes a big difference. You haven't said yet what you are out to do, but I can make a pretty good guess. You're going to try to rescue your father without letting the American authorities know anything about it. Am I right?"
Jack nodded.
"Well, I'll help you," said Stone. "I know where he is and how to get him, and I'll tell you all I know."
"Hooray!" yelled Frank impulsively. Jack and Bob contented themselves with grasping Stone's hand warmly. Realizing Stone was still bound, Bob pulled out a pocket knife and started to cut his bonds, but Stone made him desist.
"Keep this dark from Von Arnheim and Morales," he said, "and keep me tied up. They may suspect I'm throwing in with you, but I don't want them to know. I want to be able to make a getaway because these parts won't be very pleasant for me hereafter."
"That's right," said Bob. "Well, even if you won't take money, you'll have to let my father or Mr. Hampton help you in some way, with a job or something."
Stone smiled tolerantly.
"Buddy," said he, "getting along is the least of my troubles."
With Stone's aid won, the boys now set about learning from him how matters stood at the Calomares ranch. For hours they continued to talk, so absorbed that they did not realize the flight of time until Tom Bodine came to inform them that the sun was near setting and to ask what they intended to do that night. By then, however, they had obtained from Stone all the information he could give them, which was considerable. Bob had had another talk by radio with his father, and a plan for further proceedings had been worked out. Jack and Bob were to make the attempt at the rescue of Mr. Hampton alone. They were to fly to the Calomares ranch in the airplane with Bob at the wheel, as Jack was not so experienced a flyer. Bob, on the other hand, knew his machine thoroughly and was familiar with its every trick, a knowledge much to be desired as airplanes even more than motor cars and ships develop temperament and have got to be humored, so to speak. Frank rebelled at the part assigned him. He was to stay behind at the cave with Tom Bodine and Roy Stone, guarding the prisoners Morales and Von Arnheim. When they had rescued Mr. Hampton, Jack and Bob would take him in the airplane and start flying to the Hamptons' ranch. By means of the radio in the airplane, which could send 150 to 200 miles, although it could receive messages from a much greater distance, the Hamptons and Bob would notify the party left behind in the cave. Then Frank, Tom Bodine, and Stone would ride for the border on horseback. Morales and Von Arnheim would be left bound so as to prevent their giving an alarm or offering any interference with the program. After the party had been given time to make its way well along toward the border, rebel headquarters was to be notified by radio from the Hampton ranch of the location of the prisoners. The latter would, therefore, suffer nothing but inconvenience. "But what fun do I get out of this?" lamented Frank, enviously regarding Bob and Jack. "You fellows get all the fun and all the glory. I ride tamely back to the ranch."
"It's hard luck, Frank," said Bob, "but your shoulder is sore and aching from your fight last night, and I'm in better condition to operate the plane. Besides, you know we can't take you, as the plane will only hold 3, and when we get Mr. Hampton, we'll have our full complement. Some one of us has to stay behind. You've had your share of fun so far, anyhow, and your turn will come again."
"I don't see it," said Frank. "It looks to me as if when you rescue Mr. Hampton, the fun will all be over. But that's the way with you big bullies, always picking on the little fellow."
"Well, you see," said Bob mischievously, "I've got to keep you out of danger for Delia's sake." "Ow! What? Let up! Can't you take a joke?" For lame shoulder notwithstanding, Frank leapt and, bowling the big fellow out of his chair, got astride of his writhing body and began to pummel him. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. Flying to the Rescue.
Come on, strip.
It was Bob talking, and the command was addressed to Morales and von Arnheim. Tom Bodine stood guard over them with leveled revolver.
But why?
Protested von Arnheim.
Ask us no questions and we'll tell you no lies, said Tom, waving his weapon. Just do what you're told.
Sullenly the two men obeyed. When their outer clothing had been removed, and they stood revealed in the lightweight undergarments, a well-set-up powerful pair of men, about the height of Jack and Bob, although neither was so sturdy as the latter, Bob halted them.
That's enough, he said. Here, put these around you.
And he tossed them rubber ponchos, which they threw around their shoulders. Scooping up the discarded clothing of the two men, Bob and Jack retired to the radio room. Stripping quickly, Jack dressed in Morales' clothing and Bob in that of the German aviator. This arrangement was adopted because Jack could speak Spanish with considerable fluency and thus fitted into the role of the Mexican. Bob, on the other hand, was better adapted to pass as the German, who they had been informed by Roy Stone spoke Spanish only awkwardly. "Buenos dias, senor," said Jack, bowing gracefully.
"Ach du lieber Augustine,"
answered Bob, standing at salute. They burst into hearty laughter, in which they were joined by Frank and Roy Stone, who were present at the transformation. "How will we do?" asked Jack. Stone eyed them critically.
"To fellows that know Morales and von Arnheim only by sight," he said, "you will pass for them easily enough. Both of them are smooth-shaven, which is unusual, for Mexicans and Germans both favor mustaches, but that's all the better for you boys. One thing you want to remember," he said to Bob, "and that is to walk pretty stiffly like you had a bone in your leg and swallowed a ramrod. That's the way von Arnheim always steps out. And both of you keep your hats pulled down. Now you boys have got the bearings I gave you. You can easily enough find the landing field, even in the darkness. It's a big meadow as flat as a table, with the ranch house and outbuildings in a clump at one end, and the radio station with its big tower supporting the antenna at the other. Both places will be all lighted up, for Calomares lives like one of them old-time barons, and he's always got so many men around the place he needn't fear anybody. So why put out lights? He likes light. He's a bug on it, in fact."
"Suits me," said Bob. "That gives me some beacons to go by."
From the foregoing, it will be seen that the boys had changed materially their original plan of riding in as adventure-seeking American youths to enlist in rebel forces and wait their chance to effect the rescue of Mr. Hampton. As matters now stood, Bob and Jack were to land in the airplane, and while Bob stayed by it, Jack was to make his way to the room where his father was held prisoner, free him, and guide him back to the airplane, where they would fly for the border. Of course, the plan would not be so easy of execution as it sounded. To find the ranch and make a safe landing would be a fairly easy task. The ranch was not more than 50 miles distant by airline, and in that sparsely habited country there would be no other similar group of lights to puzzle Bob. Once they had alighted, however, the difficulties would be encountered. At first the boys had considered the advisability of waiting until a late hour to make their attempt. Rebel headquarters then would have retired for the night, and they would run less danger of encountering anybody on landing. In that event, however, they soon realized ranch and radio station alike would be dark, and Bob would have no beacons to guide him to landing. No, there was only one thing to do, and that was to arrive at an early hour. Moreover, there would be this advantage attached. Namely, that sentries would be lax, and that with many persons coming and going in and about the ranch, the passage of a familiar figure, such as they would take Jack to be, would arouse no comment. Jack might be halted, of course, by someone desirous of conversation, but he could make some excuse to pass on. As a matter of fact, he planned to wrap a handkerchief about his jaw and pretend to be suffering from a toothache. This would serve the double purpose of partially hiding his features and of excusing him from indulging in extended speech. "All right," said Jack, finally, as he finished donning his disguise by clapping Morales' hat on his head. "Let's go."
"Yeah, yeah," said Bob, doing a goose step.
Once more they all had a good laugh. Then Bob and Jack walked into the outer room of the cave, followed by Frank and Roy Stone. Stone had thrown caution to the winds and had decided not to try any longer to hide his defection from Morales and von Arnheim.
I'll soon be riding away from here with you anyhow, he told Frank, and they'll find out then, if they haven't already suspected. I'm going down to the airplane to see the kids off.
Frank had demanded his privilege of going down to the valley and seeing Bob and Jack get away, and the others had no thought of denying him. So all four, bearing the oil torches kept in the cave by Stone for the purposes of lighting the landing field at night, descended from the cave. Tom Bodine was left to guard the two prisoners. These had again suffered the ignominy of having their hands tied. After they had undressed, and wrapped in the rubber ponchos given them by Bob, they had flung themselves down on the pallet prepared the previous night by the boys. Stationed in the outer entrance of the cave, Tom Bodine looked around at the two prone forms several times, but always they lay motionless under their ponchos, and there seemed no cause for suspicion regarding them. Poor fellows, thought Tom. He held no particular animosity against them. They had had a hard time of it lately. After landing from a flying trip, they had been set upon and beaten. Then, made prisoner, they had spent the intervening hours cramped in bonds and in doubt as to what their captors intended doing with them. Probably were tired out and asleep by now, thought Tom. He even tiptoed over to where they lay and found, as he expected, that both had their eyes closed and were breathing heavily. Returning to the entrance, Tom took a step or two forward, so as to better see past the big rock outside and thus get a clearer view of the airplane. The boys had reached it by now. The oil flares were planted on both sides, and it was illuminated, standing out in the tossing light like a great bird. As the propeller began to whirl, Tom took another step or two forward. An airplane was a new puzzle to him, and he was so interested in watching it get under way that he forgot his trust, forgot he had prisoners to watch, forgot everything but the mystery of that piece of mechanism, that gigantic bird, running bumpily now over the ground and now beginning to lift into the air. And now Tom whirled about. The old instinct of the man who lives much in the open, telling him danger is close at hand, was stirring in the roots of his hair. But he was just a trifle too late. As he faced about, a form shot out of the cave, and Tom, totally unprepared for the attack, was bowled over. As he fell, he let out a great wordless cry, thinking to warn Frank and Roy Stone. Then the butt of a revolver descended on his head. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. The Tables Turned. "What was that?" asked Frank, turning to Roy Stone, as the airplane bearing Jack and Bob on their romantic adventure dwindled into the darkening sky. "I thought I heard a shout." "Guess you did," said Stone. "I heard it too. It came from the cave." Both turned to stare upward toward the distant cave. There was no sign of movement. Only the dim bulk of the rock obscuring the entrance could be distinguished. They looked at each other, a nameless fear stirring at their hearts. Then Frank shook himself and laughed. "Ah," he said, "this lonesome place seems spooky. I know what it must have been. It must have been Tom shouting a farewell to the fellows." "I reckon you're right," said Stone, brightening. "Sure, that must be it. Well, let's go back. We'll be starting in a couple of hours if all goes well." "All right," said Frank, reaching to pluck one of the oil flares out of the ground. Stone halted him. Again he looked anxiously toward the cave. "Let's not take the torches," said he. "Why not?" "Just playing a hunch," said Stone. "I have a feeling that all may not be well up at the cave." Frank dropped his voice unconsciously, as if fearing eavesdroppers in that lonely spot. "To tell you the truth," he said frankly, "I feel the same way. I say, I have an idea. Let's edge out of the light without hurry. Not toward the cave, but out that way." He pointed in the direction taken by the airplane. "We'll put our hands up to our eyes and pretend to be watching the sky for the airplane's flight. It would be natural for us to want to go beyond the light of these torches if we were trying to follow the boys with our eyes." "That's the ticket," said Stone, and the two put Frank's plan into execution. Beyond the light cast by the torches, they paused. Darkness had descended now, in truth. Not even the shadowy bulk of the big rock before the entrance to the cave could be distinguished. "Maybe we're making ourselves nervous over nothing," said Stone. "I feel kind of foolish. After all, what could happen? That old cowman pal of yours looks pretty capable." "He is, too," said Frank. "Just the same, I feel we ought to be cautious. If Tom's all right when we reach the cave, well and good. But if he isn't—" "You're right, kid," said Stone.
I'm no more of a coward than the next fellow, but if Morales and von Arnheim by any chance gained the upper hand and got their clutches on me, I'd hear the birdies sing."
Frank had been thinking rapidly. "Look here," he said. "Isn't there some way we can sneak up there to find out if matters are all right or not? Suppose Tom has been overcome. We wouldn't stand much of a chance approaching the cave by the regular entrance." He paused and again stared upward. "We've been gone a considerable time," he said nervously. "You'd think if he were all right, Tom would have called to find out what was delaying us."
"Tell you what," said Stone. "I've got a little private path to the top of the cave where the antenna's located. It isn't much more than a goat track, but we'll have to be goats. Never been up there in the dark, but I think I can make it. Are you game to follow me?"
"Certainly," said Frank, "if it will be of any advantage for us to do so."
"Well, there's a fissure through the rock down into the cave. That's where the Germans that put in the radio plant made their hookup. We can listen there and maybe hear something to guide us."
"Oh, I remember that," said Frank, and added excitedly, "Maybe I could crawl down into the cave."
"You might be able to at that," said Stone. "You're pretty slight, but it would be a ticklish proposition without any rope from above. Well, if you're on, let's go." Turning, he struck off across the valley, approaching the hill some distance from the path leading to the cave. Frank followed closely at his heels. Soon they began mounting upward. The climb in the darkness became more and more difficult, made more so by the care they exercised to prevent dislodging stones. They feared the clatter of these descending to the bottom would betray them. Once Stone, who was in the lead, slipped and slid backward, clutching frantically to stay his fall. Fortunately, Frank was well braced at the moment and was able to stop him. After a rest to regain their breath and calm their shaking nerves, they resumed the climb. At length Frank's feet were on level ground, and ahead he saw the outlines of two latticed towers of familiar construction, and between them overheard the strands of the antenna. The Germans, Stone earlier had explained, had built the towers in such fashion that the crest of the hill hid them from the plain on one side, while they were so far back from the edge of the flat plateau crowning the hill as to be also hidden from view from the valley. Whispering an injunction to Frank to follow close at his heels, Stone crawled on hands and knees to the fissure in the rocks down which led the wires of the hookup. It was not a straight descent into the cave, and no light came from it, but the two knelt in the darkness and put their heads close to the black opening to listen. A murmur of speech could be heard distinctly coming up through the hole. Frank could not distinguish the words, but with his limited knowledge of Spanish he was able to decipher that language was being employed.
"What is it?" he whispered to Stone. "Can you hear? Are they speaking in Spanish?"
"Silence. Just a minute," answered Stone. His voice was anxious. Frank obeyed the command. In a moment Stone lifted his head and said hoarsely, "It's Morales. He and the German must have overcome your friend in some way. And I think he's got the Calomares ranch on the phone and is giving warning that your friends are on the way." Frank groaned.
"Then, when Jack and Bob land, they'll be surprised and captured. Oh, can't we do something?" Excitedly, he jumped to his feet. "Let's put the radio out of commission."
Stone leaped up and laid a restraining hand on his arm. No. Wait a minute. The damage is done already. These fellows already have given sufficient warning to put them on guard at the ranch, even though they can't have told them the whole story." They stood undecided, looking at each other in the starlit darkness. With an exclamation, Frank seized Stone by the arm. In his excitement, he shook it.
"Jack and Bob both clamped the headpieces on when they left in the airplane," he said. "And Jack tuned the radio to the pitch of this station in order to be able to call us after rescuing his father. Why, he must have heard Morales give his warning. Yes, sirree. Why, this isn't so bad."
In their relief, the two laughed a trifle hysterically. In a moment, however, Frank sobered again.
"Just the same," he said, "the ranch would get the warning unless—"
"Unless what?"
"Unless Jack was quick enough to grasp the situation."
Stone slapped his leg. "I see what you mean," he said. "Your friend Jack could call the ranch too, and interfere so much that Morales' message would be all twisted up."
"That's it," said Frank. "And when it comes to thinking quickly and acting at once, you can count on Jack. Just the same," he added, "he can't keep that up forever. And when he lands—"
"Which he'll have to do shortly," interrupted Stone, "because the ranch is only 50 miles from here."
"Why then," continued Frank, These fellows can get their warning to the ranch and the boys will be captured. Or at least their plan to rescue Mr. Hampton will be spoiled. No, sir, we'll have to wreck the radio plant here to give them a chance. If Jack has been able so far to interfere with the warning, and we put this plant out of commission now, they may be able to carry out their rescue after all. Let's see, how will we go about it?"
Both had been so engrossed that they had failed to notice a dark form which, after creeping noiselessly up the slope, had started edging across the little plateau. Now this form suddenly straightened up and leaped forward. Frank cried out in alarm and jumped sideways just as a spurt of flames split the darkness. The bullet sped by, leaving him unharmed. Stone, who was closer and stood with back turned, whirled about. The charging form cannoned into him, and he went down. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. Frank Saves the Day. Frank's first thought was to go to the assistance of Roy Stone. The latter and his opponent, in the darkness Frank could not distinguish whether it was Morales or von Arnheim, were locked with their arms about each other and rolling on the ground. His second thought was as to the whereabouts of the other man. He glanced about in alarm. Dark though the plateau was, however, he could see there was no other in sight. Bending down to the fissure in the rock, he could still hear the voice of Morales, and although he could not distinguish the words, he received the impression that the Mexican was angered for some reason. To Frank, this meant that Morales was having difficulty in radioing the Calomares ranch, and his heart leaped with exultation. Jack had interfered. A wild thought leapt full-grown into his mind. Stone had given Bob a stiff battle. He probably would do the same to von Arnheim, even though his shoulder was sore. What was to prevent Frank from slipping down to the cave while the two were engaged, where he could release Tom Bodine, surprise Morales, and recapture the cave and the radio plant? The next moment a feeling of shame surged over him. If von Arnheim gained the upper hand, he would kill Stone without compunction. Putting aside his first thought, Frank ran to where the two forms still lay tightly locked on the ground, neither able to gain an advantage. He bent down, and the first thing his gaze encountered was an upflung hand grasping a revolver, and another hand gripped about the wrist of the first and preventing use of the weapon. He surmised it was von Arnheim who held the weapon and acted accordingly. Grasping the German's hand, he pressed back the finger so sharply a cry of pain was wrung from von Arnheim's lips. The revolver dropped to the ground. Its owner, however, pluckily continued the fight. Frank danced about, the captured weapon clubbed in his hand, ready to deal a blow when possible, but so furious was the fight that he feared to strike lest he hit his friend. Precious moments were flying by. He was in agony. Morales had to be prevented from radioing the ranch if Jack and Bob were to stand their chance. Then suddenly Roy Stone gained the upper hand of his opponent. His legs were twined about von Arnheim. He clutched the other to his chest. One arm was in the small of his back. The other was pressed across his throat. His chin was sunk deep into the German's shoulder. Von Arnheim had only one arm free. The other was pinioned to his side. With this free arm he plucked futilely at Roy's arm across his throat, unable to reach the guarded face. It was a grip von Arnheim was powerless to break, and it was only a question of time until he would be throttled into submission. With a leap of the heart, Frank realized this, and bending down with his lips to Stone's ear, he said, "I've got his gun. If you can hold him now, I'm going to the cave after Morales. He's still at the phone." A grunt was Stone's only reply as he pressed his chin deeper into the other's shoulder. Von Arnheim's body was beginning to arch like a bow. If he did not surrender soon, his back would be broken. Frank darted off down the slope. Morales was seated at the telephone as Frank entered the cave, captured revolver in his hand. His own weapon hung forgotten at his side. So little used was he to the handling of small arms. Frank had tumbled, fallen, rolled down the slope, taken no precautions, fired only with anxiety to prevent Morales from radioing while there was yet time. The Mexican also, in his anxiety to reach the ranch and give the warning, had cast caution aside. Across the outer room dashed Frank, scarcely noting the trussed-up figure of Tom Bodine flung in one corner. No hangings obscured the brightly lighted interior of the inner cave, for they had been torn down the night before to form a pallet. Morales sat with his back turned, the headpiece clamped over his ears.
Frank darted forward and brought the butt of the revolver crashing down on the Mexican's head. Without a sound, without a gurgle or a cry, Morales swayed in the chair, then slumped to one side and slid to the floor. With nervous haste, Frank pulled the headpiece from the other and clamped it on his head. At once, a crackle of Spanish words filled his ears. He could make nothing of them. What little knowledge of Spanish he had once possessed was not at his command now. "Jack! Bob!" he cried, pulling the microphone toward him. "This is Frank. Do you hear me? Frank!" The chattering ceased as if by magic. "Frank? What in the world?" Glory be! It was Jack's voice in reply. "Use the code!" cried Frank. In this emergency his brain was working lightning fast, and in their own private code he added, "It's all right now. They captured Tom Bodine while we were down in the valley seeing you off, but we've recaptured the cave." "You saved our lives," came back Jack's voice. "I heard your Mexican friend call the ranch while we were flying, and at once started to interfere. It's been a job and my throat's hoarse. But he never got his message through, I can tell you that. Whatever it was he had to tell, I never did find out. I just started interfering, singing, talking, shouting. The ranch never found out what he was trying to say, and neither did I. But boy, you are just in time. We can see the lights now. What? What's that?" What he heard was a shout. But Frank was too busy to answer his question. Morales had recovered consciousness and was on his knees and struggling to his feet, when out of the tail of his eye Frank saw his peril. Snatching the instrument from his head, he flung himself sideways. The impact of his body hurled Morales again to the floor. Frank had placed the captured revolver on the table as he telephoned. He would have to fight with his bare hands. Well, he would not let the Mexican overcome him and regain possession of that radiophone unless he killed Frank first. With hands gripped about the other's throat and legs twined about his body, Frank fought as he never thought he could fight. Morales was a heavy man, heavier even than von Arnheim, who had overcome Frank in that tempestuous fight in the darkness the night before. But his senses were still somewhat numbed from the blow on the head dealt him earlier by Frank, and the boy was fighting with a strength born of desperate resolve. Frank's grip on the Mexican's throat tightened. Morales was unable to pluck those cruel hands away. His face became purple. His eyes started from his head. Suddenly he went limp beneath Frank and sank to the floor. Frank stood up, swaying. The excitement and the strain of the combat had had their effect on him. There were a mighty few boys of his age and build who could have gone through what he did and still keep their feet. Dancing points of light swam before his vision. He brushed his hand across his eyes to clear them. He reeled and would have fallen, but his hand clutched the table and steadied him. What was it he must do? There was something which had to be done. Oh, if his head would only clear. Call Jack. Yes, that was it. Had to tell the old boy to go ahead. Radio plant still Frank's. Enemy couldn't get any warning from that Mexican fellow. Had to tell him. Had to. Clutching the table, swaying, but with lips tightly pressed together and teeth clenched, Frank made his way to the microphone. Holding the headpiece to his ear, he set his lips to the telephone instrument and called. "Jack! Jack, you there?" "Yes, yes," came back the anxious reply. "What happened?" "It's all right, Jack. Go ahead. I licked him." The headpiece fell from his grasp, and Frank sank to the floor. It was there a moment later that Roy Stone found him, fallen in a heap across the body of the Mexican. Both were unconscious. Stone was shaky himself. His battle with von Arnheim had been a severe one, and the wound in his shoulder had started bleeding again. But as his gaze took in the situation, he turned to Tom Bodine, whose bonds had been cut on his way through the outer cave, and said in a tone of warmest admiration, "Some boy." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. Danger at Hand. Bob, as well as Jack, had heard Frank's explanation of the occurrences at the cave, for he also wore a headpiece as he piloted the airplane. And it was with warm admiration toward the absent chum who so heroically had thwarted Morales' attempt to betray their hazardous expedition that he circled now above the two groups of lights which marked the Calomares ranch and radio station. Smaller and smaller grew the circles as with engine shut off he volplaned. The field was hard packed and smooth, and the plane alighted finally with practically no jar. When it came to a dead stop at last, Bob drew a long breath of relief. He had not been up for several weeks, and night flying above strange country to a landing on unfamiliar ground had been a strain upon him. There were no mechanics running out to greet the alighting plane and trundle it into its hangar. Had this been a well-appointed landing field, such absence would have been suspicious. But to Bob and Jack it meant only confirmation of Roystone's remark that they were a careless lot at the ranch. "Now for it," said Jack, clambering out of the plane. The two chums stared around them, trying to pierce the darkness. They were in the middle of a long and wide field. A ring of low hills encircled them, the tops clearly outlined against the velvety sky. Overhead twinkled stars, brighter, warmer, and apparently closer than when viewed in their Long Island home. The hills on either hand were close. So, too, was the rampart at their back, over which they had flown. Those ahead were more distant, for it was in that direction extended the valley. Behind them was the radio plant, with its tracery of tower and antenna against the sky, and the windows of the powerhouse gleaming from the light within. Ahead was a long, irregular clump of buildings set among trees. Some were dark, but the main structure, which they knew from Stone's description was the ranch house, was brightly lighted. Try as they would to pierce the darkness, the boys were unable to discern anything other than this. There was not a human figure in sight. They gazed with especial interest toward the ranch house, because it was somewhere within those walls that Mr. Hampton was held prisoner. Soon, if all went well, Jack would be making his way within in search of his father. At the thought, his heart, which heretofore had been calm enough, began to beat rapidly, and for a moment he felt as if he were about to suffocate. His breath almost failed him. It was not an unnatural feeling, and soon passed. But Bob, noting the labored breathing, climbed from the airplane and put an arm over his chum's shoulder. "Steady, Jack," he said. "Everything's gonna be all right." The friendly gesture and sympathy in his chum's voice did steady Jack. "All right now, Bob," he said. "Just at first, though." "Righto," the big fellow answered. "I'm scared stiff myself, and I'm not even going into the ranch. If I were in your boots, I'd probably be shaking myself loose from them." The pleasantry was what Jack needed. He grinned at the thought of Big Bob shaking so much with fear as to shake off his shoes, and his recovery was complete. The plan was for Jack, in the dress and character of Morales, to go to the ranch house, enter boldly, and make his way to the room where his father was held prisoner. Bob was to stay with the plane. Releasing his father, Jack would return with him. Then they would all three fly away across the international boundary to the north. It was impossible to foretell, of course, what obstacles to the carrying out of this daring proposal would arise. Both boys felt certain, however, that so far they were not suspected, and that first Jack and then Frank had successfully thwarted the attempt of Morales to send a warning to the ranch by radio. Neither was aware, of course, that the jumble of sounds through the air when Jack from the airplane had interfered with Morales' attempt to warn the ranch, and later the coded conversation between Jack and Frank, after the latter had obtained possession of the radio plant in the cave and had overcome Morales, had aroused the curiosity and then the suspicions of the young German Muller, who operated the radio plant at the Calomares ranch. A few moments before the beat of its engine in the sky signalized the approach of an airplane, Muller had decided to go to the ranch and report to Calomares. He had crossed the landing field afoot and had just reached the belt of trees when the machine volplaned to the field behind him. Although, as has been said, his suspicions were aroused, Muller was far from suspecting the truth. He had no idea the airplane had been recovered by its rightful owners, and that these latter were about to make a daring attempt to rescue Mr. Hampton. His thought, on the contrary, was that something, he could not make a more definite surmise, had gone wrong at the cave. Therefore, when after standing several minutes at the belt of trees, gazing back toward the airplane, he saw a figure start from it for the ranch house, he believed it was either von Arnheim or Morales coming to report. Muller was a sycophant, the type of man eager to curry favor with those in authority. He decided he would gain the ear of the great Calomares first. That would detract somewhat from the glory of the other when he arrived. Turning, he darted for the ranch. Meantime, Jack was making his way ahead more slowly. While not attempting to hide, he was on unfamiliar ground and felt that it behooved him to follow implicitly the directions given by Roy Stone and make no mistakes. Passing through the grove, Jack came in sight of the ranch. He paused in astonishment. Roy Stone's description of the great house had prepared him in measure. Yet he was astounded. Here indeed was a palace in the wilderness. The mansion stood on a slight elevation with a lawn in front sloping down to the trees from which Jack had emerged. In design, it was like a country house of the ancient Roman aristocracy. The walls were of vari-colored bricks, with inlaid designs representing formal flowers. 2 stories in height, with the towers at the corners rising another 2 stories higher. The building was in 2 wings or sections, joined in front by a marble-tiled walk, roofed and pillared, but with the sides open. Inside, between these 2 wings, Roy Stone had told Jack, was an open court. Nerving himself to the ordeal and pulling down his hat to obscure his features, Jack crossed the lawn and started mounting the wide flight of stone steps, flanked by crouching stone lions. He reached the marble tiles of the walk above, and then, despite his anxiety to gain the left wing and the tower where his father was confined, he involuntarily paused. The scene before him was one of the strangest to be found on the North American continent. This marble courtyard, with its overhanging balcony around the sides and rear, and its splashing fountain and pool in the center, the whole illuminated by the soft glow of electric lights cunningly concealed along the edges of the balcony like footlights on the lip of a stage. But it was not this alone which held Jack's gaze riveted and caused a smothered cry of surprise to burst from his lips. Involuntarily he stepped from the shelter of a pillar behind which he had been standing. For approaching along the balcony of the left wing, Jack saw the loved figure of his father, engrossed in conversation with a small, dark man of patrician bearing. It was instinct rather than conscious thought which checked the cry on his lips. Instinct told him a shout would mean betrayal, and the shattering of his desperate plan. Yet, careless of who might see, he stood there looking up at the distant figure until it was lost to view, cut off by the outjutting roof above him. That one sight, however, lifted a vast load from the boy's mind. His father, at least, was not mistreated. Evidently, the man with him was the Don. And just as evidently, his father was treated more as a guest than a prisoner. At sound of footstep on the marble tiles behind him, Jack returned with a start to a realization of his surroundings and the perils of his position. Assuming a carelessness which he was far from feeling, he refrained from turning about, but instead started walking for the left wing ahead in the tower of which he knew his father to be lodged. But the step behind him was accelerated, and he was hailed by name as Morales. Jack halted. Here was the first ordeal to be passed. Well, he was prepared for it. According to his plan, he had bound his face in a handkerchief and intended to pretend having a toothache. The swathings partly hid his features, and the pulled-down hat further obscured them. "I'm busy. Don't delay me," he growled in Spanish, imitating Morales' voice. The newcomer approached. It was Muller. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. The Night Attack. When Jack's figure had become merged in the shadows of the grove, Big Bob, standing beside the airplane, reached a decision. "Not a soul in sight here," he muttered to himself, once more letting his gaze rove over his surroundings. "Jack thought it would be best for me to stay here, but nobody's going to monkey with the plane. I'm going to follow him till he reaches the house anyhow. He may need my help." Thus the big fellow salved his conscience from departing from orders. But he was so eager to take a hand in proceedings that he felt it would be torture to stay behind. He was dressed in von Arnheim's clothes, and his build was that of the German aviator. If he were observed, he would not be suspected. Even his atrocious Spanish would not betray him, as the German spoke the language almost as horribly as he. Thus he reasoned to himself as he strode rapidly after Jack. When he reached the other side of the grove and came in sight of the ranch house, Bob, as Jack had done, halted in amazement at sight of the splendid structure. He gazed around him. Nobody in sight. Shrubbery intervening prevented him from gaining a clear view of the house. He started to skirt the bushes. Meantime, not far away, the conversation between Jack and Muller was nearing a climax. Approaching the pretended Morales, Muller asked what he had tried to convey in his radio call, explaining it had been so interfered with by another mysterious call as to be non-understandable. Not knowing Muller was the radio man at the ranch, Jack was nonplussed. Again he answered that he could not be delayed and started to withdraw. Then Muller laid a detaining hand on his arm. "Keep it to yourself if you want to," Muller said, "but I know something happened at the cave, and I have already reported it to the Don. First I thought you were trying to radio from the cave.
Now here you come by airplane. There's..."
"What do you mean?"
growled Jack gruffly, although secretly alarmed.
"I mean there's something wrong,"
Muller said. Muller still had no suspicion that the man before him was other than he pretended to be. Merely he was trying to pry into a matter that had aroused his curiosity. Jack, however, thought he was on the eve of being discovered, and was alarmed. At this moment Bob, skirting a clump of bushes on the lawn below, came in sight of the two figures and halted. He saw Jack wrench his arm from the other's grasp and turn to stride away. He saw the other raise an arm as if to stay Jack, and he saw the movement flip Jack's low pulled hat from his head. It was accidental, but to Jack and Bob, the actor and observer in this little drama, it seemed to be by intent. It is possible Jack still might have saved the day had he stooped quickly, recovered his hat, and clapped it on again before Muller could have seen his features. As it was, however, Jack thought he was discovered, and he turned to deal with Muller. Then, in truth, he was discovered. Muller cried out in amazement. Then Jack landed a stinging blow on the mouth which sent the young German toppling to the marble pave. At Muller's shout, several rebel sentries, who had been snoozing in the shadows beside the palace instead of mounting guard, were startled into instant wakefulness. They came trotting in bare feet, long rifles in hand, and ran up the wide flight of steps. Bob started forward to help Jack. The latter, however, took one look at the sentries and then dashed into the left wing of the building. The sentries for a moment did not pursue, believing the fleeing man was Morales. Instead, they bent above Muller and helped him to his feet. Bob halted and backed into the bushes, keeping his eyes on the scene. No use rushing in to help Jack now. He would merely succeed in getting into trouble himself, without aiding his chum. From his vantage point, he was able to read aright what followed. Although he could not overhear what was being said, and would not have understood the Spanish words if he had overheard, nevertheless, he gathered that Muller was explaining the fugitive was not Morales, but someone wearing his clothes. Then he saw sentries dart away in pursuit of Jack, while Muller whipped out a revolver and fired 3 shots into the air.
"That's an alarm," Bob said to himself. "I'd better back off before this place is alive with soldiers."
Turning, he ran through the trees. Big Bob was not the one to desert a friend, but he saw no chance to help Jack now. On the other hand, he told himself, if he retained his freedom, he would be able to help Jack later, perhaps. Suddenly, he caromed into a man running toward the house. Both rebounded from the contact. Bob saw the other was a Mexican with a rifle, and quick as thought, he lashed out with his right fist and caught the soldier on the point of the jaw. Totally unprepared for this attack, the man went down as if shot. Bob ran at redoubled speed, burst through the screens of trees, and dashed across the landing field toward his airplane. He had no definite idea as to what course to pursue. He and Jack, of course, had counted upon the possibility of Jack's being discovered. In that case, when he heard the alarm, Bob, supposedly sticking by his airplane, was to have flown away. There were shouts behind him. Evidently, his soldier victim had recovered. Perhaps even Muller had suspected the truth, namely that if Jack were not Morales, then the aviator who brought him was not von Arnheim. In that case, Muller would be on his trail, and he would have no time to lose. What should he do? The shouts behind him were not repeated. Perhaps, after all, his identity was not yet suspected, and he was not pursued. Jack might be keeping all hands busy at the ranch. In great leaps he approached the airplane, and as he drew near, another thought obtruded itself. If he were to take flight in it, how would he get away? Who would crank the motor by twirling the propeller? This latter difficulty was quickly solved. 2 Mexicans stood at respectful attention as he approached. Bob was dismayed for a moment, but then, seeing their awkward salute, he chuckled inwardly. They mistook him for von Arnheim, and evidently that German officer was a martinet who exacted a measure of discipline from the slovenly rebel soldiers. Cracking an order at them in his best garbled Spanish, Bob clambered into the pilot's seat. He was understood, and better, was obeyed. One man gingerly approached the propeller and started twirling it, while the other went to the side of the plane and helped push it forward. The propeller began to whirl furiously as Bob worked the starting mechanism. The Mexicans leapt out of the way, and the plane began to bump ahead. Shouts of anger burst forth at the same moment. There was a crack of a rifle, and a bullet sang unpleasantly close to Bob's ears. Out of the tail of his eye, he could see a number of dark figures running toward him from the grove. But Bob did not wait to be interviewed. With a swoop, the airplane left the ground and started upward. His pursuers were so close at hand they could almost grasp the wheels as they leapt upward. Yet not quite. Bullets whistled about him and several pinged against the body of the machine with a sharp metallic ring. Bob thanked his stars that the plane had an all-metal body. Once above pursuit, he was safe from the stray rifle shots. With a curse, the baffled Muller, who had been quick to realize that if one masquerader was not Morales, then the other was not von Arnheim, watched the airplane shoot away at dizzying speed and disappear beyond the guarding hills to the north. Then he turned back toward the ranch house, eager to learn how the pursuit of Jack had ended. But for the young Herr Muller and the Calomares ranch in general, the night alarms were not ended. In fact, they had just begun. Before Muller on his return trip had reached the belt of the trees, while the search for Jack, who had mysteriously disappeared, went on merrily within the Calomares palace, and while Bob was yet flying over the hills to the north, rebel pickets below him were attacked by Mexican government troops. It was an attack force. "Viva Obregon!" shouted the attackers. The rebels on the northern rampart of the hills defending the natural amphitheater where the Calomares ranch was located fell back hurriedly. They were outnumbered. Out of the huddled buildings which the boys had only glimpsed at the rear of the great ranch house boiled scores of rebel soldiery, rubbing the sleep from their eyes, hugging their rifles as they trotted forward in bare feet. Within the house the search for Jack was temporarily abandoned, while the peppery little Don Fernandez Calomares, alarmed at this night attack, which might mean that the government troops were in force, hastened to take command outdoors. To Bob, who, having crossed the crest of the hill and shut off his motor and volplaning, the shots and cries of the attackers came distinctly. He had intended making a hazardous landing beyond the rebel lines and returning afoot to try and rescue Jack. But this newest development in the situation caused him to open the motor and start to spiraling upward. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Señorita Rafaela.
Meantime, what of Jack? After bowling Muller over and fleeing from the sentries drawn by the latter's shout, Jack ran through the great arched doorway into the left wing of the palace. Ahead lay a dark corridor, upon which opened doors to the ground floor rooms. He was in a round entranceway from which ascended a flight of winding stone steps to the balconied upper floor and the turret room above. Up there somewhere was his father. Jack paused only a moment, then sprang up the steps. As he reached the upper landing, he heard the sound of footsteps descending from the tower. He listened a moment. They were not the familiar footsteps of his father. He must act quickly if he were to stand any chance of escape. Springing forward, revolver in hand, he seized the knob of the nearest door on the balcony, found the door give, and leaped in, pushing it behind him and setting his back against it. The room was brightly lighted, evidently a young lady's boudoir. This much his first glance showed Jack. It showed him also two women, one young and very beautiful, the other wizened and monkey-like, both terrified and speechless. They were Don Fernandez's daughter, Rafaela, and her duenna, or chaperone, Donna Ana. "Quiet," hissed Jack in Spanish, waving his weapon threateningly. He listened with strained attention to sounds from outside. The menacing footsteps reached the landing and then continued to descend. Jack turned the key in the lock. He was none too soon. A moment later, the padding of the bare feet of the sentries sounded muffled outside, then grew fainter as the two men separated, one ascending the stairway of the tower, the other running along the balcony. Jack was puzzled as to what to do next. From Roy Stone's brief description of the Don's family, he guessed at the identities of the two women. While he stood irresolute, the girl recovered from her fright. Her dark eyes flashed, and she commanded him in an imperious tone to lower his weapon. "Not till you promise me not to shout, miss," Jack said.
"Very well," said the girl. "But who are you? You cannot escape. My father will capture you."
"Not if I can help it, miss," Jack said grimly. In the rapid march of events, the handkerchief with which he had bound up his jaw had become loosened. Now it fell, revealing Jack's handsome features and his close clinging mop of dark curls.
"Why, you're just a boy,"
declared Rafaela, and her eyes lost some of their hostility, while at the same time, unconsciously, her voice became less harsh.
"Surely,"
she said, turning to Donna Ana,
This lad can have done nothing so terrible."
The prim black-robed duenna had gained courage from her mistress's temerity. She had ceased trembling, yet she was exercised about something. Jack could not understand why. Surely she was no longer fearful of him. She leaned closer to her young mistress, seated at a low writing table, and whispered in her ear. Rafaela threw back her head and laughed, a low musical laugh that sounded fascinatingly pleasant in Jack's ears, worried though he was.
"My dear Donna Anna," said the girl, "what if he is a man, and in my room? Are you not here to watch over me? And I do not believe he will bite. No, no. See, he is such a nice young man that I can chuck him under the chin, so."
And suiting action to words, the girl sprang from her chair, walked swiftly across the room, and chucked Jack under the chin. To say that Jack was surprised would be a mild statement. From his knowledge of Latin American girls gathered in Peru, he believed those of good family invariably were convent bred and extremely decorous in the presence of young men. He was so dazed at the girl's action that her next move, which was a lightning-quick attempt to grasp his revolver and wrest it from him, almost succeeded. Jack retained a grip of the weapon, however, and managed to prevent Rafaela from obtaining it. Foiled in her attempt, all her bravado deserted her, and running back to her chair, she sank into it and began to weep. What in the world should a fellow do in a case like this? Jack didn't know. Usually he was equal to emergencies, but this was something beyond his understanding. He stood helpless, while the duenna alternately glared at him and patted her young charge on the back, muttering soft words of comfort to her meanwhile. Quickly as the shower came, however, it disappeared. Rafaela pushed Donna Anna aside impatiently and looked at Jack, smiling through her tears.
"Well, sir," she said demurely, "that did not succeed. What do you intend to do with your prisoners?"
This wasn't so bad, Jack grinned. "Look here," he said, sensing a kindred spirit. "I'm not a rascal. You will have to believe me. I haven't done anything so terrible after all. You need not be scared of me."
"But who are you then?"
asked the girl.
"Listen, they are shouting through the house. Soon they will be making a search from room to room."
Jack started. If that were true, when the searchers came to this locked door, what would happen? He thought for a moment. The daring idea to take the girl into his confidence and enlist her aid had been budding in his mind. He regarded her keenly for the first time. Would she help? Perhaps the romantic nature of his enterprise would appeal to her, even though he was fighting against her father. Well, it would do no harm to try. "You ask who I am," he said, "and why I am here. Well, I shall tell you." And speaking rapidly in his fluent Spanish, in a few brief statements he laid before her the main fact that Mr. Hampton, whom she doubtless knew, was his father, and that he had come to the rescue in an airplane. "Only now," he concluded mournfully, "I have been discovered. I expect my chum will be forced to fly away, and it looks as if I were bound to fail." During his recital, the girl's eyes had grown bright with interest. She leaned forward, listening with eager attention. As Jack ceased, apparently she was about to speak, but there came a tattoo of knuckles on the door which caused her to halt abruptly.
"Our deliverers,"
murmured Donna Anna, who had never entirely ceased trembling, and she cast a spiteful glance at Jack. To the duenna, young men, and especially one so unceremonious, were terrible creatures.
"Silence,"
hissed the girl, and the old duenna, in evident fear of her imperious young mistress, trembled the more.
"Quick," whispered
Rafaela to Jack.
"get under here."
Rising, she seized him by an arm and partly led, partly pushed him to a chair upon which she had been sitting. It was a wicker chair, with wicker latticed sides extending clear to the floor. Lifting it, she ordered Jack to kneel down and crouch into as small a space as possible. He complied. Then she clapped the chair over him. He was completely hidden, except in front, where the wicker latticing did not extend. Seating herself calmly in the chair, Rafaela so disposed her skirts so that Jack could not be seen. Then she picked up her pen and sat as if just interrupted at her writing. The knocking on the door was repeated, louder this time, and the voice of the Don himself impatiently bade that the door be opened. Bending low so that Jack could hear her words, the girl whispered,
"Have no fear. Trust me."
To the duenna she said,
"Open the door, and if you betray me."
And she shot at Donna Anna a terrible glance, which caused the latter to cringe. Evidently the duenna stood in considerable awe of her temperamental young mistress. The old woman unlocked the door and stepped back, revealing on the threshold Don Fernandez and several armed retainers at his back. "What does this mean?" he demanded, glaring at his daughter as he advanced a step or two into the room. "Locked doors at so early an hour?"
"Why, Papa, dear, we heard the shouts and several revolver shots," said his daughter. "Was it not natural for two lone women to lock their door?"
The Don glanced quickly about the room.
"Papa, what is the matter? What is the meaning of all this noise? Of those shots?"
Rafaela anxiously inquired. "Some man impersonating one of my lieutenants gained entrance," said the Don. "I believe him a government agent. He may have come to attempt my life."
"Oh, no, Papa, dear," protested Rafaela, shocked. "Why, he—"
Frantic lest she might betray herself and him, Jack reached forward cautiously and tapped the tiny ankle dangling before him. He was none too soon. Thus brought to a realization of her position, Rafaela checked her words. "What's that?" asked her father. "What did you say?"
"Why, Papa," she answered, "I was going to say, he couldn't be so mean to come here to kill you. Oh, no, that would be too terrible."
"But I do believe it," affirmed the Don. "What do you know of how politics is carried on in our poor, distracted country? Tut, tut, you are just a girl. What I come to ask is whether the man had hidden here. We have searched all the rooms on this balcony without success. Yet, most certainly, Pedro and Pancho," indicating the armed men in the corridor, "saw him bound up the stairs."
"Here?" said
Rafaela.
"Why, our door has been locked, as you see."
Before Don Fernandez could retort, the report of distant rifle fire came to the ears of all in the room, followed by a growing fusillade as the sentries on the northern rim of the valley fell back before the attack. The Don whirled around. "Hark," he said, and added with conviction, "the government troops are attacking, and they sent an assassin ahead of them. Well, he has been foiled, and they will be foiled too." And without more ado, he darted from the room, Pancho and Pedro obediently following at his heels. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of the Radio Boys on the Mexican Border. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. The Fair Traitress. Rafaela leapt up and lifted her chair, permitting Jack to emerge from his unique hiding place. He was overcome with gratitude at the thought of what she had done for him, and hesitated to speak.
"Speak,"
she said, frowning, and stamped her foot.
"Tell me, is it true?"
"What do you mean?" asked Jack in surprise.
"That you're an assassin sent by that horrible President Obregon."
Jack was hurt and showed his feelings. "I told you the truth," he said.
"Oh, I want to believe you," cried the girl, twisting her hands. "But father was so positive."
Donna Anna sidled close and whispered,
"Shall I call your father? It's not too late."
That decided Rafaela.
"Nonsense," she declared sharply, glaring at her duenna. "Cannot you see this young man is telling the truth? I," she declared proudly, "can tell a truthful person from a liar at once, and I declare to you this young man is truthful."
Jack smothered a smile. The girl was as changeable as a weathercock. And calling him young man in that lofty tone, too. Why, she was little more than a youngster herself. Couldn't be as old as he.
"Come now," said the girl suddenly, seizing him by the hand. "We have no time to lose. Now is your opportunity."
"Opportunity?"
Yes, yes, impatiently. "While the government troops attack, you must release your father and escape."
Jack was amazed. Would this surprising girl never cease astonishing him? "Do you mean you will help me, actually?"
"Have I not said so?" asked Rafaela impatiently. "And it seems to me I have already been of some trifling aid, actually."
The sarcasm was not lost on Jack, but he ignored it. Finding he still held the hand she had extended when urging him to follow her, he squeezed it. You're fine," he said enthusiastically. Rafaela tossed her head, smiling in superior fashion.
"You are not a very accomplished courtier, Mr. Jack Hampton," she said, withdrawing her hand.
Jack would have protested. He was rapidly falling under the spell of her charm, but she halted him with an imperious gesture.
"We are wasting precious time," she said. "Come."
Then turning to Donna Anna, she said sharply,
"You will stay here until I return, and if you betray me—"
Again she made a threatening gesture, and again the old duenna cowered.
Thereupon the girl hastened from the room, and Jack followed. Up the spiral stone stairway of the tower ran Rafaela, passing the first landing where burned an electric light. Jack was close at her heels. At length they reached the top landing, and stood before a single door there. It was of stout oak, heavy and ponderous.
"This is your father's room," whispered
Rafaela. So near to a successful conclusion of his adventure, Jack's heart beat so rapidly that once again he experienced that sensation of suffocation which had seized him on landing from the airplane. He tried the doorknob. The barrier was locked. "Locked," he whispered. "What shall we do?" In the dim light of the landing, they stared at each other in dismay. Here was a contingency which had occurred to neither. The whispering, the careful trying of the door, the sound of their footsteps, these had aroused Mr. Hampton from his reading on the other side of the door. "Who's there?" he called sharply. Jack set his mouth close to the keyhole. "Dad," he whispered tensely. "It's Jack. Don't make a noise. I've come to rescue you." There was a moment of silence, then the sound of rapid footsteps crossing the room. "Jack?" Mr. Hampton also had stooped to the keyhole. "It can't be. Yet that voice. My boy. But how in the world did you come here?" "Too long to tell, Dad," whispered Jack. "But have you the key to this door?" "Key? No." "Then," said Jack despairingly, "it looks as if we're balked at the end. This door is too stout to break down without bringing the enemy on us. It's thick and bound with iron straps besides." "Who's with you?" "Bob. No, I mean Miss Calomares. She's helping me." "This is too much for me," declared Mr. Hampton. "Dad, we'll have to break down the door. The government troops are attacking. Even if we do make a lot of noise, it may go unnoticed. Have you a heavy chair you can use?" "Yes," answered his father. "But wait, government troops attacking, hey? Then that is what the meaning of those shots which caused Don Fernandez to leave me so hurriedly." "No, Dad. Those first shots were when they sounded the alarm on discovering me." "They discovered you?" Mr. Hampton groaned in mock dismay. "Oh, this is too much. But, Jack, what I started to say was that Don Fernandez dashed down the steps. I heard him drop something in his haste, and it rang on the stones. Maybe that was the key." "I'll look." Jack stood upright and communicated to the impatient Rafaela what his father had said. She had been unable to hear. Fortunately, he carried an electric torch. Swinging this so the light fell on the steps, he started downward. Before he had gone 3 steps, the girl's quick eyes saw the key gleaming in the light. She snatched it up with an exclamation, turned, inserted it into the keyhole, and the door swung in. Jack leaped through the opening, and the tall and handsome man to whom he bore so striking a resemblance enfolded him in his arms. My boy, I can hardly believe it." "But it's true, Dad." They drew apart and stood looking at each other. There was more than a suspicion of moisture in each pair of eyes. Mr. Hampton's gaze fell on Rafaela, with whom he had had a number of pleasant conversations during his captivity. He dropped a hand on her shoulder. "My dear girl," he said, "you never did a kinder deed. I hope you will not have cause to regret it."
"Oh," she said with an arch smile, "Papa would be furious if he discovered what I have done, but I can manage him."
The older man smiled. He had observed the managerial process at work.
"But you must not delay," added Rafaela anxiously. "Even now the firing seems to be farther away. My father keeps many soldiers here, and he is doubtless driving away the attacking party. You must go quickly before he returns, and while all is confusion."
"She's right, Dad," said Jack. "Let's go. Anything you want to take with you?"
"No, nothing. But how are we to escape, Jack? How did you arrive?"
"I arrived by airplane," said Jack. "But whether we can get away by the same means is another matter." Mr. Hampton looked dazed.
"The younger generation moves too fast for me," he said. "But will you please explain?"
"It's a long story, Dad," said Jack, "and I haven't the time. But it's Bob's airplane. The fellows who kidnapped you stole the machine in Long Island several days before that. Well, Mr. Temple and the boys came out to New Mexico, and we recovered the plane, and, well, there you are."
"Yes, I see," said Mr. Hampton. "It's as clear as the New York fog. But it's enough to know that Bob, didn't you mention his name, is here with the machine. Let's go find him."
He started for the door, but at that moment, Rafaela, who stood closer to it, halted him with an upraised hand.
"Listen,"
she whispered. Cautious footsteps could be heard ascending the stairs.
"Quick, Jack," whispered Mr. Hampton. "You mustn't be seen. Nor you, Miss Calomares. Here, hide behind this bed."
And he pushed the two behind the hangings of a great 4-poster. Then, removing the key from the outside of the door, he hurriedly but noiselessly swung the ponderous frame shut and locked it on the inside.
"Calomares won't recall losing the key," he said grimly to himself. "There may be a chance yet."
He listened with his ear at the keyhole. The cautious footsteps mounted higher. They reached the landing. Then there was a low knock on the panel, and a voice called low and urgently, "Mr. Hampton, Mr. Hampton, this is Bob." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. 3 Cheers for the Radio Boys. Mr. Hampton unlocked and opened the door, and greeted the big fellow as warmly as he had his own son. "Where's Jack?" asked Bob. "Did they capture him?" Jack, who was peeping from behind the 4 posters, sprang into the room and slapped his chum resoundingly on the back. "I thought you were supposed to stick by the airplane," he said, with mock severity. Bob swung around, the worried look vanishing from his face. "Hooray," he said. "So they didn't get you after all. When I saw you punch that fellow, I thought your goose was cooked." "Saw me punch him? Why, where were you?" "Oh, I had followed you," said Bob. Then he explained. "Then, when the attack began," he added, "I flew around overhead until I saw my chance to return and land. I wasn't going to leave without you. Presently, the government troops were beaten at the north. That was only a feint on their part anyhow, I believe, to engage the attention of the rebels. For at once heavy shooting broke out farther down the valley. Sounded like the main body was attacking there. Then the rebels scooted down that way to repulse the new attack, and I took a chance and landed. Not a soul in sight. And here I am." Jack was speechless, but the look in his eyes betrayed his emotion.
"Bob, I'm proud of you," said Mr. Hampton. "Well, let's hurry away before it's too late."
Rafaela stepped from her place of concealment.
"Aren't you going to say a farewell?" she asked.
Bob looked at her in astonishment. Mr. Hampton, with a twinkle in his eye, viewed Jack ardently. The latter advanced with extended hand. "Miss Calomares," he said, "I cannot tell you how grateful I am. I hope we shall meet again." "Miss Calomares," muttered Bob under his breath, his eyes on the beautiful girl. "Jack certainly has moved fast. I don't get this." Mr. Hampton took pity on him.
"Miss Calomares," he said, leading Bob forward, "this is my son's chum. He came with him tonight in his airplane."
The girl held out her hand. Bob took it as in a daze. "Pinch me," he said in an aside to Jack. All heard the remark and laughed at Bob's mystification. "Come," said Mr. Hampton, and once more moved toward the door. Once more, however, his steps were arrested by a noise outside. This time they heard the shouts of many men approaching the house and crying, "Viva Calomares!"
"Too late," groaned Mr. Hampton. "They have driven off the attack and are returning."
Rafaela uttered an exclamation.
"Oh, I must go to my room before Papa discovers me here,"
she cried. She darted for the door, but paused to give them a parting cheer.
"Do not give up hope," she said. "They will drink a great deal, and then all will sleep very soundly. You may escape late tonight. Goodbye."
And turning, she ran lightly down the steps. Jack's eyes followed. At the turning, she paused, looked back, and waved to him, then disappeared. "Now what will we do?" said Jack.
"You boys hide behind the bed," said Mr. Hampton. "I'll close the door, but I won't lock it this time. For on second thought, I believe if it were locked and Calomares came up to see me, as he frequently does before retiring, it would make him suspicious. I shall leave it unlocked, and then he will believe he left it so himself in his haste."
"Dad," said Jack, "I have an idea."
"What is it? Out with it."
"Well, we are trapped here. Suppose we turn the tables." "What do you mean?" asked Bob. "Well, Dad," said Jack, turning to his father, "didn't you say Don Fernandez comes to call on you before retiring?"
"Yes, we've become good companions. He guards me carefully, keeps me a prisoner for his own ends, but he is a cultured man, and we have much in common."
"Father says," asserted Bob, "that you are being held prisoner in order to make trouble between the United States and the Mexican government."
"He is correct," approved Mr. Hampton. "Don Fernandez has not attempted to conceal from me that is his desire. He sent a demand for a preposterous ransom merely in order to precipitate action at Washington, and he's been wondering why no action was taken."
"Well, that's what Father thought," declared Bob.
So he has kept the matter of you being kidnapped a secret. Instead of appealing to our government, we set out to rescue you. Father says we must do our utmost to avert trouble between Mexico and the United States." "So that accounts for many things," said Mr. Hampton. "I'm glad to have them cleared up. But we are forgetting your idea, Jack. What is it?"
"Simply that we capture Don Fernandez and make him release us all under a guarantee of safe conduct," said Jack. "You see," he added, "Bob and I are both armed, and we can do it."
"Good for you, Jack," said Bob. "I believe it can be done," said Mr. Hampton. "And here," he added, listening, "comes our opportunity, if I'm not mistaken. You boys get behind the four-poster and wait till I give you your cue." Noiselessly, Mr. Hampton closed the door as the boys went into hiding. Then the older man resumed his seat by the table, picking up his book, and appeared to be reading. Quick, light footsteps sounded on the landing outside. There was a pause while Don Fernandez searched his pockets for the key to the door. Unable to find it, he turned as if to depart. To 3 pairs of ears straining to hear his every movement, the interpretation was clear. He believed he had locked the door and lost the key and was about to depart. Mr. Hampton saved the situation by raising his voice and calling. "Is that you, Don Fernandez? Will you not honor me by coming in? I'm eager to learn what has occurred." The Don decided to try the door. To his surprise, it opened to his touch. "I must have forgotten to lock it in my haste," he muttered, and stepped into the room. "Government troops," he said, "advancing. They thought to surprise us, but we have beaten them off decisively." He sat down heavily. "It has been strenuous work," he said, "but that is over. Now to find the assassin, if he has not already escaped." "Assassin?" queried Mr. Hampton in genuine surprise. He had not been told the Don's belief regarding Jack. "Yes," said Don Fernandez violently, "that miserable Obregon." He proceeded to relate his version of Jack's arrival. "Oh, but you're mistaken," said Mr. Hampton coolly. "That was no assassin. It was my son. He came here to rescue me." Don Fernandez leapt to his feet as if shot upward by a spring. "Your son!" he cried. "Come to rescue you? Preposterous. Then why are you here?" "Because," said Jack, stepping from hiding, with a revolver leveled, "I wanted to meet you." "Yeah, and so did I," said Bob, not to be outdone, as he emerged also with leveled weapon from the other side of the four-poster. Mr. Hampton quickly slipped the key into the lock of the door, turned it, and drew back. Don Fernandez saw the action. He glared from one to the other of the 3, and then sat down with a resigned shrug of the shoulders. "You want to meet me?" he said. "I am honored. But, Mr. Hampton, there is not only one son, but 2. "Not exactly," said the American. "This lad," laying a hand on Jack's shoulder, "is my son. The young man you pursued for a time tonight. This other," placing his other hand on Bob's shoulder, "is my son's chum." "Well," said Don Fernandez, the faintest suggestion of a twinkle in his eye, "now that you have met me, as you desired, what have you to say?" "Just this," said Jack boldly. "We want you to permit us to leave under safe conduct. We want to take father with us in Bob's airplane. Oh, yes, it was my chum's airplane which your men stole in Long Island, but we've gotten it back again." "So?" said Don Fernandez. "Well, nothing surprises me tonight. And where, may I ask, are Morales and Von Arnheim? I see you are wearing their clothes." "We've got them imprisoned," said Jack. "But we are in earnest, sir, about this. We are armed and have the upper hand, and we mean to have your protection. If you are armed, you had better give your weapon to father." "As your father very well knows," said the Don, "I never carry weapons. And now," with grave courtesy, "if you will permit me, young sir, I would like to speak privately with your father." At a nod of agreement from his father, Jack withdrew to the door, followed by Bob, leaving the 2 older men in low-voiced conversation. They spoke animatedly, and to the 2 anxious boys there came more than once a low chuckle of laughter from Don Fernandez, while they could see Mr. Hampton beginning to smile. At length Don Fernandez beckoned imperiously, and the boys approached. He regarded them with twinkling in his eyes, but it was Mr. Hampton who acted as the spokesman. "Boys," he said, "Don Fernandez consents, but I do not believe he was influenced by fear for his life." Don Fernandez stood up between the 2 chums and put an arm over the shoulder of each, or rather tried to, as they towered well above him. "No, it was not fear," said he, "but Mr. Hampton has told me a little of what you have done, and I see it is useless to fight against young America. You are fine fellows. If I had a son," wistfully, I would want him to be like you.
End of chapter 29.